And good morning to everyone. This is so wild. I'm accustomed, because of the past 14 months, to standing here and talking to either just a camera or maybe like 1, 2, 3 others. It's such a joy to be here and to see a sea of faces, while recognizing at the same time that not everyone is here. Darlene, I think your word at the beginning hit the nail on the head. There's a mixture of emotions on a morning like this morning, not least of all because of even our very timeline that we had set up has been disrupted due to weather. And yet I still find myself grateful this morning. Grateful for this building and this space. Grateful for the ability for many of you right now who are watching to be able to tune in, which, by the way, Esther and Daniel, hello. For the first time ever, Esther, when I left, was like, Dad, say hi to me when you go. So this is it, Esther, hello. But seriously, though, welcome to all of you joining online. So good to see you all. It feels good to be continuing to move forward. Speaking of which, we right now are in the midst of a series called Restart, Moving into Life. And this series really touches on this reality that for 14 months now, there's a sense in which for much of last year, all of life, for many of us, came to a halt, or at least it felt like it did. Many aspects of our lives stopped, or at least were disrupted or changed dramatically. And now we come to a point where it's Memorial Day weekend. Things are starting to open up more and more. Life is slowly, maybe quickly for some, beginning to move forward. And with that momentum comes an opportunity for all of us to take an inventory of our lives and ask the question, how might God be inviting us to restart? 2 weeks ago, we talked about how what it might look like to move into hope. Last week, we talked about what it might look like to move into faith. And this morning, we're talking about what it might look like to move into love. And we're going to talk about a particular expression of love. You know, in line with Darlene's word this morning of there being a mixture of emotions, I'm sure that these past 14 months has come with its own mixture of experiences and emotions for you. I've heard from a number of people who all of a sudden found themselves working from home and being with and near those they live with in much higher doses has been, on the one hand, a blessing. Right? A lot of parents now who either had a long commute are now at home, which means more time with family, less time in a car or in traffic. All of life in some ways has slowed down. There's been a forced Sabbath of sorts. And I've heard from many people just the blessing that's been. And yet at the same time, it's probably not a big surprise to hear that being locked down with, let's say you live with people, also has come with its stresses. And that for many relationships, this lockdown has put an added stress or burden on tensions or conflicts that already existed. Listen to these stats I just came across last week. In 2020, a leading British law firm had a 122% increase in divorce-related inquiries between July and October, compared with the same period in 2019. In the US, a major legal contract creation site reported a 34% rise in sales of its basic divorce agreement. 20% of those sales were from newlyweds, those who had just gotten married 5 months prior. There's been a similar pattern detected in China, which had probably the strictest of all lockdowns, in the world, and a similar pattern detected as well in Sweden, which was on the, shall we say, more laissez-faire side of things when it comes to lockdowns. All of this simply goes to show that despite all the blessings, the past 14 months, this pandemic has come at a cost for many relationships, and not just marriage relationships, but friendships, neighbor relationships, every kind of relationship we have. Now, whatever your experience has been over this past year, the fact is, relationships, pandemic or not, are difficult. Relationships are difficult. Think about it. When someone you're close to hurts you, something breaks inside, doesn't it? Something breaks because you feel like you've been wronged and therefore it needs to be made right. And so you react, you respond, you want retribution. You want to make it right, and perhaps you want to hurt them back. And so if you do, then the original offender likely might feel like it was an overreaction, like the punishment doesn't fit the crime. And so they then respond as well. And this creates what we might call a cycle of vengeance. We see this cycle of vengeance played out from the geopolitical stage, the highest levels, when it begins with one nation firing a rocket over to the other, that nation then firing 2, and then 3, and then pretty soon, once that cycle starts going, it really doesn't matter who fired the first rocket anymore. The cycle of vengeance has become and has started rolling, and how does it stop? This happens at the geopolitical level, but in our interpersonal relationships, this happens as well. I mean, I think of the husband who, let's say, forgets to take the trash out. This never happens in my home. Forgets to take the trash out. And the next morning, his wife notices and is a little annoyed because this isn't the first time, and she makes a snide comment. Well, the husband takes it a little harder than perhaps he should have. It cuts a little deeper, and he explodes. He reacts. She then withdraws and retreats. And they stop talking for a day, which turns into 2 days, which turns into 3 days, and the cycle of vengeance grows, and the distance between these two parties grows as well. If you have ever been in a relationship where you've experienced hurt, where that hurt has grown into a cycle of vengeance, of shame, of pain, then very likely you have wondered out loud or in your own heart, how does a cycle like this stop? How does the cycle of vengeance stop? It is this very question that Jesus addresses. And if we have ears to hear this morning, I want to suggest that he has the answer that we all need, that if we want to move into love, if we want to restart any of the relationships in our lives in this unique time, then let's listen to Jesus. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 18, Jesus is talking with one of his disciples, Peter. And they have a very brief exchange, and it begins with Peter coming to Jesus. And we're told in verse 21, then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. I find Peter's question intriguing, right? He comes to Jesus, and probably with a good heart, wants to know, like, okay, so Jesus, what's the limit on forgiveness? Right now, side note for some context. There was a scholarly debate during this time among Jewish scholars around the question of how many times does God forgive? right? And they had their Bible verses to back it up, but a lot of scholars believe the answer was 3. God forgives 3 times, and then the gavel comes. He forgives 3 times, and then comes judgment. And that, therefore, should be our guide. So Peter, probably influenced by Jesus, knowing Jesus is generous, he comes to Jesus, and he ups the ante a little. And he says, okay, Jesus, now, when someone sins against me, how many times should I forgive? Right? And he doesn't go with the scholarly consensus. He takes the 3, he doubles it, and then he adds 1. Again, he's been hanging out with Jesus. And he says, how many times should I forgive? 7? Thinking, that's pretty generous, right? And Jesus looks at him. He says, no, 77. Now, when Jesus says 77, don't hear him saying, you literally should only forgive someone 77 times. Like, keep count, because once 77 hits, boom, all bets are off. You no longer have to forgive. No, Jesus is making a rhetorical point. And in fact, to understand what Jesus is getting at and what he means when he says 77, let's go back to the book of Genesis. See, Jesus knew his scriptures well. And in the very beginning of the book of Genesis, there's this story in chapter 4 about this guy named Lamech. Lamech was bragging to his wives about something. And yes, his wives. He was bragging to his wives about something that had happened. You see, a young man had come to him and had in some way hurt him or injured him. And so Lamech, talking to his wives, is bragging, and this is what he says. He says, if Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech, referring to himself, 77 times. In other words, what Lamech is saying is, hey, if someone hits me 7 times, I'm going to hit them 77 times. In other words, don't mess with Lamech. This is the kind of person I am. You don't want to mess with me, right? And so that Jesus obviously knew this story. And Peter comes to him and says, okay, Jesus, so how many times should we forgive? Like 7 times? And Jesus says, no, Peter, not 7. 77. And in so doing, he exposes that tendency in every single one of our hearts. That tendency, like Lamech, when hit, to want to hit back harder. And Jesus says, yeah, but that's not the way. That's not the way of the kingdom. The way of the kingdom is just as extreme, just in the opposite direction. You are to forgive 77 times. See, Peter wants to put a limit on forgiveness, and Jesus says there is no limit. Now, let's just hit the pause button for a minute and just recognize something that at least goes through my mind when I read Jesus' words, and probably yours. Forgiveness is hard. Can we just admit this together? Like, forgiveness is hard. And I think one of the things that makes forgiveness so hard is the fact that we so often misunderstand what forgiveness is. Oftentimes, the way forgiveness is talked about or used, we can easily get the idea that to forgive someone is to in some way like dismiss the wrong that's been done. As if when I say, I forgive you, that's another way of saying, hey, what you did really doesn't matter that much. Like, it's all good. That's not what forgiveness means. In fact, forgiveness implies, the very first word of forgiveness is a recognition that something wrong has been done. Which is why if I were to walk up to you after the service today, and the very first thing I said was, I forgive you. You'd probably be like, what did I do to offend Michael, right? Because just saying the words implies that something wrong has been done. To forgive someone is not to dismiss the wrong that has been done. It's not to wipe it clean and to say, hey, it doesn't hurt. It was totally fine what happened. Another way we often misunderstand forgiveness is when we assume that it always must mean reconciliation. Now, reconciliation is always the goal, is always the aim, but sometimes it's just not possible. And sometimes it looks different and in different ways. There are some relationships where it would be dangerous and unwise for there to be reconciliation. At least the way that particular relationship operates in a given moment. So forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. It doesn't always mean that the guilty party admits that they've done something wrong. And so it's easy to have misunderstandings around what forgiveness actually is. But I think there's an added challenge in our culture to forgiveness. And it's that, quite frankly, especially in the cultural moment in which we live, it's just so much easier to just cancel someone. Right? Are you all familiar with this phenomenon of cancel culture? That language may be familiar with you. If you're not familiar with quote, cancel culture, according to Wikipedia, cancel culture or call-out culture is a modern form of ostracism in which someone is thrust out of social or professional circles, whether it be online, on social media, or in person. Those subject to this ostracism are said to have been canceled. And so, for example, some high-profile celebrity or individual says something wildly inappropriate, or they tweet something, or something has been discovered about their past. It gets broadcasted, and they get lambasted on social media, right? They get canceled. Now let me just say, in general, when it comes to cancel culture, this is not all bad. In fact, there's a very good thing about cancel culture. It is good that people are being called out for things that they've done that are wrong. Like that is a good thing. Especially when there are people who have had no voice in society for, let's say, the past 50 or 60 years, to all of a sudden have a platform to be able to name things that are wrong, that are evil, that are unjust. This is a good thing. The problem with cancel culture is not that people are called out for doing wrong. The problem is that once someone is put in the bucket of shame, they are kept there. And they are meant to be kept there. And we are not told in any way by cancel culture that we should move toward reconciliation, that there should be forgiveness extended. There is no room for forgiveness because once someone has been canceled, they have been segregated to the bucket of shame, and that is where they are to remain. And the reality is that cancel culture is simply a projection of what goes on in every single one of our hearts to one degree or another, isn't it? I read a list recently of the things that we tend to tell ourselves to keep us from having to forgive someone. And it was very uncomfortable to read, which is why I'd like to share it with you now. Here it goes. Again, things that we tell ourselves that keep us from forgiving. He needs to learn a lesson. I don't want to encourage irresponsible behavior. I'll let her stew for a while. It'll do her good. She needs to learn that actions have consequences. I was the wronged party. It's not up to me to make the first move. How can I forgive if he's not even sorry? I don't know which of any of these are familiar to you. Many of them, unfortunately, are familiar to me. But here's the thing. See, when someone hurts or offends us, Cancel culture tells us to cancel the person. The way of Jesus, however, teaches us to cancel their offense. See, Jesus knows that forgiveness is hard. He knows that forgiveness is hard. And so it's worth asking the question, if forgiveness is so hard, why is it so important? Why is it so central to the way of Jesus? Well, to answer this question, Jesus himself tells a story. And rather than read the story, I'm going to summarize it. He tells a story about a king. And this king decides that he's going to settle all of his accounts. And so he calls in a servant who owes him an obscene amount of money, like 10,000 bags of gold. We'll just call it $100 million. He calls in this servant, and Jesus, he was such a good storyteller. Like, he knew how to push certain buttons and get certain reactions. The servant comes in, and the king is like, okay, so you owe me $100 million. Do you have it? The servant is like, no, I don't. And the king says, okay, well then I'm going to sell you and your wife and your kids and your property in order to recoup as much of that as possible. And the servant falls to the ground and he begs for mercy. And he says, please be patient. I will repay it. I promise. Just give me mercy. And then amazingly, the king does. And not only that, the king says, you know what? I'm so moved. I'm going to forgive all of your debt. And so this guy, he just had $100 million debt wiped clean, and he gets up and he walks out. And that would be a feel-good story until this guy, this servant, then goes to one of his fellow servants who owes him, we'll say, $100. And he's furious. And he goes to this guy and he's like, hey, you owe me $100. And the other servant is like, I'm so sorry. I don't have it. Please just have mercy on me. Be patient. I'll make it up and I'll pay you back. And the servant who had just been forgiven $100 million has this guy thrown into jail because he owes him $100 and can't pay. Well, the king finds out about it and is less than excited. And so he calls in the servant and he's like, dude, what is your problem? I just forgave you $100 million and this poor guy owed you $100 and you threw him into jail? That is so messed up. You now are going to jail. Right? And the story ends. Right? And this is a warning that Jesus has, that he gives. And here's the thing. If we want to understand why forgiveness is so central to the way of Jesus, there are at least two lessons from this story that we have to grasp. Two lessons from this story that have to sink into our hearts. And the first lesson is this. Forgiveness is so important to the way of Jesus because this is what God is like. This is what God is like. The entire story that Jesus tells is predicated on this king who forgives someone an obscene debt, just an insane debt. That king, of course, is God. The Christian story at its very center is a story about a God who comes to a world who has racked up an obscene debt, a world who has run far away. And this God, rather than come and cancel this world, rather than come with condemnation, he comes to forgive. Like whatever lies you may have believed about God, whatever stories you've heard growing up, whatever church experiences you've had that have given you or painted this picture of a God who is cruel and vindictive and comes with this heart of condemnation to a world that has run away, it's just not true. God forgives. God is merciful. The Apostle Paul in the book of Colossians put it this way. He said, He forgave us all our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us. He has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. And then in the next chapter, Paul explicitly says, forgive as the Lord forgave you. This is who God is. He is one who forgives. Whatever your story, whatever weight you are carrying, whatever burden weighs you down day after day after day, God is one who comes to lift, to take away, and to forgive. And we know this because this is the God we see when we look at Jesus. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, of course, Jesus can forgive. I mean, he's the Son of God, right? So forgiveness is probably easy for Jesus. Well, actually, forgiveness was hard for Jesus. It was painful for Jesus. It actually was deadly for Jesus. You may recall the scene. Jesus, the night before he died on the cross, he was in a garden praying. And he knew that the one he called Father was calling him to go to a cross and die for the forgiveness of the sins of the world. And he knew it would be painful. And he also knew he didn't want to do it, which is why 3 times in this garden, as he's praying to the Father, he's saying, please take this cup from me. I don't want to do this. Ultimately, though, he did. Because he said, not my will, Father, but your will be done. Forgiveness was hard for Jesus. It was painful for Jesus. And ultimately, it was deadly. See, forgiveness is painful because it always involves a death. In order for forgiveness to happen, something has to die in our hearts. The New Testament, the word forgiveness literally means to haul away, to release, to free yourself from. And when someone wrongs us, there's a sense in which we can hold over them that wrong, like a weight. And we, in a sense, have a right to, and we feel that we can hold this thing over them. But what forgiveness does is it removes that. And that's hard. And it hurts because something has to die within our hearts in order for that to happen. But this is exactly what God has done for us through Jesus. Forgiveness is so important because this is what God is like. But there's one other lesson from this story that we have to grasp. One other thing we have to understand in order to realize why forgiveness is so important. And it's this: forgiveness is hard, but the alternative is so much harder. Forgiveness is painful, but unforgiveness is even more painful. Do you notice how the story ends? It doesn't end well for the servant who did not forgive his fellow servant. Like, imagine if this guy, having just been forgiven like $100 million, found his friend and was like, oh, by the way, dude, forget about that $100, all right? Like, imagine the life he had before him. It would have been amazing, but instead, he chose the path of unforgiveness, and it did not end well for him, and this is Jesus' point. Forgiveness is hard, but the alternative is so much harder. You've heard it said probably just as often as I have, bitterness is the poison you drink, hoping the other person dies. As one New Testament scholar put it, the first and often only person to be healed by forgiveness is the person who does the forgiveness. When we forgive, we set a prisoner free and then discover that the prisoner we set free was us. I experienced this personally, just recently. My daughter Esther was having a particularly difficult day. I don't remember the details, it's kind of blurry. But let's just say she was not listening and obeying. And I got a little frustrated. And so there was a conflict there. And she said things and she did things that merited an apology from her. And she did not want to apologize. And so there was a tension there. My daughter is 6. Okay, there was a tension there for a good part of the day. And eventually, in one of our interactions, I said, listen, Esther, sweetheart, let's skip over all the tantrums. Let's just skip over all of this. Let's just skip over all this distance. Let's just get to the part where you say you're sorry, and I say I forgive you, and we hug. The moment I said the word forgive, she just broke down. And she just started crying, and she just melted into my arms. And that's not the part that surprised me. Because she, as she fell into my arms, said, I'm sorry. To which I said, I forgive you. The moment I said that, I then broke down. And I melted because without knowing it, I was carrying this burden. I was carrying something that had just been weighing me down. I knew there was this distance between my daughter and me, and this cycle was just gaining more and more speed. And it wasn't until I said, I forgive you, that it was lifted. Forgiveness is hard, but the alternative is harder. I want to end this morning with a very simple question. How might Jesus be inviting you this morning to follow him in the way of forgiveness? How might Jesus be inviting you to follow him in the way of forgiveness? Maybe there's someone that you need to forgive. Maybe there's someone in your life that you need to forgive. And let's just acknowledge that forgiveness can look different. It does look different. It depends on the relationship that you have with someone or the non-relationship that you have with someone. Maybe the person that you need to forgive isn't alive anymore. Maybe reconciliation isn't an option. Maybe it's a phone call. Maybe there's someone you need to forgive. Or maybe there's someone who needs forgiveness from you. Maybe there's someone, let me say that again. Maybe there's someone you need forgiveness from. And maybe what God's inviting you to do this morning is to say the 3 most difficult words, I am sorry. Or maybe you're here this morning or you're viewing this morning and you've never actually received the forgiveness of God. Maybe you've heard about this God of forgiveness, or maybe you've been carrying around this weight, thinking it's something that you have to bear. And this morning you are hearing this good news that God forgives. And he's inviting you to, maybe for the first time ever, recognize your need for his forgiveness. How might Jesus be inviting you to follow him in the way of forgiveness? May we all respond faithfully to this question this morning. Will you pray with me? Father, we pause now, recognizing the fact that forgiveness is hard because it involves a death. And Father, we also come before you grateful for the fact that the reason why we forgive is because you have first forgiven us. That we have racked up a debt that we have run from you, and you've run after us, and that you offer forgiveness to anyone who would simply turn and recognize our need. Father, give us the strength through your Spirit to follow your Son Jesus in the way of forgiveness, whatever that might look like. We love you too, Father, and we pray in your Son's name and by your Spirit. Amen.